10 men walked out of that forest. 47 went in. I know because I was one of the 10. And I am the only one left who will talk about it. My name is Walter. I am 83 years old, and I live above my son's hardware store in a town I have no particular attachment to, which suits me fine. I have a chair by the window, a pot of coffee I make too strong, and about 67 years of a memory I cannot put down no matter how many times I have tried. I have tried plenty. You do not forget the kind of thing I am going to tell you about. The ordinary years dissolve. The faces of people I loved go soft at the edges. But what I saw in that forest stays sharp. Every detail, every sound, every second of it, like it happened this morning and not most of a lifetime ago. I am telling this now because I am the last one. Owen died 4 winters back. Raymond went the winter before that. The others are long gone. There is nobody left who was there, which means there is nobody left to confirm what I say, and there is also nobody left to tell me to keep quiet about it. So I am going to tell it, all of it. And I am going to tell it the way it actually happened, not the way the official paperwork described it, which was a very tidy account of a very untidy thing. I want to start somewhere most people would not start. I want to start at the end, because the end is what gives the rest of it its weight. The morning we walked out, none of us spoke. 47 men had gone up that valley road on foot in the early autumn, packs on our backs, some of us joking, some of us quiet, all of us thinking about pay and duration and getting home before the cold really set in. 10 of us came back down. No packs, no equipment, no commanding officer, and not one of us said a single word for the entire 7-hour walk to the nearest town. 7 hours of mountain road, and not one word. I think about that a lot. What kind of thing does that to a group of men? What kind of thing empties you out so completely that you walk for 7 hours through the cold in total silence and none of you even tries to fill it? I am going to tell you what that thing was. But first you need to understand why I was there at all, because that matters, and because it is the part of this story that I think most people will recognize, even if nothing else that follows makes any sense to them at all. If you want to know what drives a man into a dark place, look at his kitchen table. Look at what is or is not on it. Look at the faces around it. That will tell you everything. My father left when I was 14. Not dramatically. He just did not come home one evening, and that was that. My mother worked as a seamstress, and she was good at it, but there were 3 of us kids, and the numbers never quite added up no matter how carefully she ran them. I left school at 16 and went to work at a timber processing yard on the edge of town. The work was hard, and the pay was modest, and it was enough, barely, if nothing went wrong. Things went wrong. My mother got sick 2 winters in a row, nothing serious, but serious enough to cost us, and by the time the recruitment notice went up in the window of the post office, I had already done the arithmetic 3 times and come to the same answer each time. The unit was offering more per month than I made at the yard in 6 weeks. The posting was described as a supply and logistics detail at a highland outpost. Duration estimated at 6 to 8 weeks. Low risk, they said. Routine. I was 22 years old, and I believed them, not because I was naive, but because I needed to believe them, which is a different thing entirely and much more dangerous. I signed the paper on a Tuesday. I told my mother it was good money for easy work. She looked at me the way she had been looking at me since my father left, like she was calculating the odds of something and did not like what she was getting. She did not try to stop me. She understood arithmetic, too. We assembled at a staging point 2 days later. About 50 of us at first, then down to 47 after the initial medical checks. I did not know any of them. I remember looking around at the group that first morning and doing what you do, sizing people up, figuring out who was going to be useful and who was going to be a problem. 2 men stood out to me immediately. One was a big, quiet man named Owen, former cattle driver, with the kind of stillness you only see in people who have spent years alone in open country. He stood slightly apart from the group, and he was not looking at the other men. He was looking at the hills on the horizon, just watching them, steady and unhurried, the way you watch something you know to be capable of surprising you. The other was a man named Raymond, a school teacher, thin, early 30s, with a small leather notebook already open in his hand even before we had been given any information worth writing down. He had a habit of pressing the notebook against his chest when he was not writing in it, like he was keeping it warm or keeping it safe. I did not know why I noticed that. I filed it away the same way you file away small things that your gut tells you are not actually small. We started moving the next morning before the sun was fully up. The road into the highlands was narrow, and the trees on either side got taller and darker the further we went. By the second afternoon, the canopy was closing over the road, and the light had gone from warm to gray-white, the kind of flat, cold light that makes distances hard to judge. Owen walked near the front of the column, and he never stopped watching the tree line. Not nervously, just constantly. I fell into step near him at one point, and he glanced at me and then looked back at the trees. He said nothing. I said nothing. We walked like that for about an hour, and it was, I think now, the most honest conversation I had with anyone that entire first week. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know, and there is a lot more of this to tell. The outpost was not what any of us had pictured. I do not know exactly what I had been expecting, something more established, I suppose, something that looked like it had been there long enough to be confident in itself. What we found instead was a clearing hacked out of old-growth forest on 3 sides, with a sheer rock face on the 4th that went straight up and disappeared into low cloud. There were 2 supply sheds built from rough-cut timber that had already started to warp in the mountain damp. A command tent reinforced with extra canvas and rope. A cook area that was just a fire pit ringed with flat stones and an iron grate over the top. And around the whole perimeter, a low fence of sharpened stakes and wire that looked less like a defensive barrier and more like a suggestion. Our commanding officer was a man named Captain Aldrich, mid-40s, career military, the kind of man who had clearly stopped being surprised by anything some years back and had organized his whole personality around that fact. He was calm in the way that deep, cold water is calm, and his briefing that first evening was clean and efficient. Patrol schedules, weapon protocols, supply rotation. Then, near the end, almost as an afterthought, he said that no one was to go past the tree line unaccompanied after dark, for any reason. He said it once, paused, and then said it again in exactly the same tone. No added emphasis, no explanation attached. Just the repetition itself, hanging there in the cold air. Nobody asked why. You learn quickly in that kind of environment that certain rules do not come with explanations. They come with the repetition, and the repetition is the explanation. I looked at Owen when the captain said it. Owen was looking at the forest. That night I lay in my bunk in the supply shed, listening to the wind move through the pines above the clearing, and I thought about my mother's face the morning I left. That calculation she was always running. I wondered if she had already arrived at an answer I had not caught up to yet. I fell asleep eventually. When I woke up in the middle of the night, the wind had stopped. The forest was completely silent. And that silence, I realized, was the wrong kind. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of something holding still. The captain knew something before we arrived. I am certain of that now. I was not certain then, but I am now. And it changes the way I remember everything that followed. He had been too calm. Not the calm of a man who expects nothing unusual, but the calm of a man who has already decided how he is going to handle something unusual when it arrives. There is a difference, and it is not subtle. One is relaxed. The other is braced. Aldrich was braced from the first morning. I just did not have the language for it yet. The rule about the tree line was not the only thing he said twice. On the third day, he gathered the section leaders and gave them updated patrol boundaries. And at the end of that meeting, which I was not supposed to be present for, but was because Raymond had asked me to help him carry the supply manifests, and nobody stopped us, Aldrich said something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, "If any man reports seeing something he cannot explain, I want that man to come to me directly and quietly. Not to his bunkmates, not to the group, to me. Quietly." One of the section leaders asked him what he meant by that. Aldrich looked at him for a moment and then said, "You will know it when it needs to apply." That was all. He folded the map he had been holding and walked back to the command tent and did not discuss it further. Raymond wrote it down. He wrote everything down. I watched him write it in that small leather notebook, his handwriting tight and careful even in the cold, and then pressed the notebook back against his chest like he always did. I asked him once why he kept it there, against his ribs instead of in his pack. He said the damp got into paper from the outside in, but body heat kept it dry from the inside out. Practical answer. True answer. But I also think he kept it close because it was already becoming something more than a log. It was becoming the only record of what was actually happening, as opposed to what was officially happening. And some part of him already knew those two things were going to diverge considerably. The first 4 days were work, hard, physical, straightforward work. Reinforcing the sheds, running supply inventories, clearing drainage channels around the perimeter so the melt runoff did not pool under the tent foundations. The mountain air at that altitude had a smell to it I had never encountered before. Cold resin and wet stone, and something underneath that I could never quite name. Something older than the trees, like the earth itself was exhaling slowly. You stopped noticing it after a while. That was probably a mistake. I worked alongside Owen most of those first days. He was efficient and quiet and very good at anticipating what needed to happen before you had to explain it, which made him excellent to work with, and also slightly unnerving in the way that very perceptive people can be unnerving. He did not volunteer information about himself. I learned over time that he had spent about 12 years driving cattle across open country before the posting, working routes that took him through some remote territory, and that this had given him a relationship with landscape that was almost physical. He did not look at terrain the way most people do. He read it the way you read a face, looking for what it was about to do next. On the fourth afternoon, we were reinforcing the eastern shed wall when Owen put down his tools and looked at the northern end of the clearing without saying anything. I followed his gaze. The 4 mules were at the far end of their enclosure, pressed together against the south-facing wall, away from the forest. They were not moving. Their ears were flat and their heads were low, and they were all facing the same direction, south, away from the tree line. They had been fine that morning, fed, watered, calm enough. Whatever had changed, it had changed in the last few hours. I said, "They do that often." Owen said, "No. Just that. No." I watched them for another minute. 4 unrelated animals that had shown no particular attachment to each other for the entire march up, now pressed flank to flank like they were trying to occupy the same square foot of ground. The smell of the enclosure was sharp, the way animal fear has a smell, acrid and close. One of them stamped once and then went still again. We reported it to the unit veterinary assistant, a young man named Callum, who had done 2 years of agricultural college before the war and was very confident in the limits of what he knew. He checked the animals thoroughly: temperature, eyes, hooves, gums. He said they were physically fine. He said altitude sometimes caused stress behaviors in working animals, especially if there had been a change in barometric pressure. He said it with the particular certainty of someone offering an explanation they find personally reassuring. Owen listened to him politely. When Callum left, he looked at me and said, "Barometric pressure does not make 4 animals face the same direction." I did not have an answer for that. I do not think he expected one. That night I had the early watch rotation, 2 hours on the western perimeter from just after dark. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the stars were very clear above the clearing. The kind of clear you only get at altitude when the air has been scrubbed clean by cold. Beautiful, if you were in the mood for beautiful. I was not particularly. I kept thinking about the mules and the way Owen had said no. Just that one word, like the answer was simple and the question was the wrong one. I was 20 minutes from the end of my rotation when I heard it. It was coming from the direction the mules had been facing, from the northern forest. And it was the kind of sound that does not give you time to decide how to feel about it before your body has already made that decision for you. My hands were cold before I registered that I had gone cold. My breathing had already slowed before I consciously chose to be quiet. Some older part of me had taken over, and it had made a very clear assessment, and the assessment was, do not move, do not speak, and do not look away from those trees. The sound lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and then it stopped, and the stopping was worse than the sound itself. I need to try to describe it, because I have never found the right words for it in 67 years of trying. It was not loud. That was the first thing. It was low, below the wind, below the normal register of things you consciously hear, the kind of frequency you feel in your back teeth and your sternum before your ears even process it as sound. It had a rhythm to it, not a melody, nothing you could hum, but a pulse, like something enormous breathing with intention. And underneath that pulse there were intervals, pauses, spaces that kept almost forming into a pattern your brain could grab hold of, and then slipping away before it could. Like a language with the words removed, like communication stripped down to the bare shape of itself. I stood at the western perimeter, and I did not move for what I believe was close to 5 minutes. My rifle was in my hands, and I was not raising it. Something about the sound made raising it feel like exactly the wrong thing to do, the way you instinctively know not to run when a large animal is watching you. My hands were shaking slightly from the cold, and also from something that was not the cold. The trees were dark and close, and the sound came from everywhere inside that darkness at once, not from a specific point, just from the darkness itself, as if the forest was its own instrument, and something was playing it. Then it stopped. Clean stop, no fade, just gone. And the silence that came back was not the same silence as before. It was heavier. It had been replaced rather than restored. I finished my rotation and handed off to the next man without saying anything about it. I walked back to the shed, sat on the edge of my bunk, and sat there for a while in the dark with my hands on my knees. Owen was awake on the other side of the shed. I could tell by his breathing. Neither of us spoke. In the morning, I went to Raymond before breakfast and told him what I had heard. He did not look surprised. He opened his notebook, wrote for about 30 seconds, and then looked up and told me that 2 other men had reported similar sounds over the past 3 nights and had said nothing because they assumed they had imagined it. He had not said anything either because he was still deciding what it meant. I asked him what he thought it meant now. He closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest. He said he thought it meant we were not the first people to be listened to in this clearing. I reported it to Aldrich that morning, the way he had said to do, directly and quietly. He was standing outside the command tent with a mug of something that had long since gone cold, looking at the north tree line. I told him what I had heard, the duration, the character of it, the way it stopped. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded and told me he would have it recorded. He said it in the voice he used for things he had decided to deal with by containing, not resolving. I watched him go back inside the tent. I noticed he had not looked surprised either. Whatever was out there, it had been out there before we arrived. I was certain of that by mid-morning. And the captain had known that. And he had brought 47 men up here anyway, which meant someone above him had made a calculation that 47 men were an acceptable thing to put in the path of whatever was making those sounds. I thought about that for a long time, and then I made myself stop thinking about it because there was no useful place for that thought to go. Work continued. That is the strange thing about fear in a structured environment. You keep doing the work. You eat, and you haul supplies, and you reinforce walls, and you rotate patrols, and the routine becomes the thing you hold on to, because without it, there is just the fear and nothing else. Most of the men did not talk about what they were hearing at night. 1 or 2 had started sleeping with their boots on. Nobody mentioned it. Owen found the marks on the 6th morning. He had been checking the fence line on the northern perimeter, looking for any sections that had worked loose overnight, when he called me over with a quiet gesture, the kind of gesture that does not draw attention. I crossed the clearing and crouched beside him where he was kneeling at the base of one of the fence posts. The post was solid timber, a section of trunk about the width of my forearm, driven deep into the ground and braced with wire. At about shoulder height, on the forest-facing side, there were 4 parallel marks in the wood. Each one went about 2 centimeters deep. They were spaced unevenly, slightly wider apart at the top than the bottom, and they were clean-edged, pressed rather than scratched, the way you press into soft wood with something very hard and very deliberate. They went across the grain. I looked at Owen. He was looking at the marks. He said, "These were not here yesterday." I had done the fence check with him the afternoon before. He was right. They had not been there. He reached out and put 3 of his own fingers alongside the marks to compare. His hand was large. His fingers did not span the distance between the outermost marks by a good margin. Whatever had made them was not working with human scale hands. We stood up and looked at the tree line. The trees were dense and dark and completely still. No wind that morning. The air smelled of cold pine and wet bark, and underneath that, faint but present, something else. Something that reminded me of old stone in a deep place, cold and mineral and very old. I had not noticed that smell before, or maybe I had and had not registered it as separate from the forest. Now I was registering it. Owen looked at the marks one more time. He said, "It was at the fence last night, standing at the fence, looking in." He said it quietly and without drama, the way he said most things, as a statement of fact rather than an expression of fear. But I saw him glance at the command tent, and I saw what was in that glance. It was not panic. It was calculation. The same calculation I was doing. We were on one side of a fence that something very large had stood at in the dark, and the fence had done absolutely nothing to stop it from reaching over if it had wanted to. It had pressed its hand against the wood and left marks, and then stepped back into the forest, which meant it had made a choice. It had been close enough to reach us, and it had chosen not to. And that choice, the fact of it, the deliberateness of it, was somehow more frightening than if it had simply come through. Raymond was going to need to know about this, but when I turned to go find him, I saw him already standing at the door of the supply shed, 30 meters away, watching us. He had his notebook open. He had already seen. By the end of the first week, 3 men had stopped sleeping, and nobody was talking about why. Raymond had documented it before anyone else admitted it out loud. He had been watching the men the way he watched everything, quietly, systematically, without making it obvious. He showed me his notes one evening after supper while the others were gathered around the cook fire. He had written down names, dates, observable changes. One man had stopped eating full portions 4 days in. 2 others had taken to sitting with their backs against walls, even during the day, even when there was no tactical reason for it. A 4th had begun completing his watch rotations early and standing outside the command tent afterward, not knocking, just standing there, like he was waiting for permission to say something he had not yet found the words for. Raymond had written it all down in that tight, careful hand, and when I read it back, it looked like a clinical account of a group of people slowly reorganizing themselves around a threat their minds had registered, but their mouths had not yet been allowed to name. I asked him what he thought was happening to them. He said he thought the sounds at night were doing something to people's sense of where safety was and was not. He said when a person cannot locate the source of a threat, the threat becomes everywhere. And when the threat is everywhere, the inside of your own head stops feeling like a refuge. He said it quietly and without drama, and it was one of the most frightening things anyone said to me that entire month, because it was precise, and it was accurate, and it was already happening to me, too. That same evening, Aldrich called a brief assembly and reminded the unit of the operational importance of maintaining routine. He said routine was the structure that kept a unit functional under pressure, and that any man experiencing difficulties should come to him directly. He said it well. He meant it. And it made almost no difference at all, because what was pressing on those men was not addressable by routine. Routine is a human invention. What was outside that fence was not interested in human inventions. What I had not told Raymond yet, what I had not told anyone, was what I had noticed about the marks on the fence post. I had gone back to look at them again that afternoon, alone, while Owen was occupied with the mule enclosure. I brought a short length of measuring cord, the kind we used for supply assessments. I measured the span between the outermost marks and the depth of the impression at the center point. Then I stood with my back to the fence post and looked at the clearing. From that position, standing at the fence, the line of sight ran directly over the cook fire, directly across the supply shed door, and directly to the canvas wall of the command tent. If something had stood at that fence and looked in, it had not been looking in generally. It had been looking at specific things, taking in the layout, understanding the arrangement of the camp. I stood there for a long time in the cold afternoon light and felt something I had not felt since I was a child, and got lost in the woods near my grandmother's house for about 3 hours. Not panic. The specific feeling of understanding that you are in a space that belongs to something else, and that something else is aware you are there. I went and found Owen and told him what I had worked out about the sightline. He listened without expression. Then he walked to the fence post himself, stood in the position I described, and looked at the camp. He stood there for almost a full minute. Then he walked back to me and said, "It knows which tent is the commander's." He said it the same way he said everything, as a plain fact, as something that had to be accounted for. I have never forgotten the way that sentence landed. It knows which tent is the commander's. Everything that came after, I think about it through that sentence. That night the sounds came back, but different. Not the low, rhythmic pulse I had heard before. This was more intermittent, further away, almost like something moving a great distance off, and occasionally becoming audible as it moved. It lasted most of the night. Several men reported hearing it at shift change. Aldrich logged it, same as before. Unknown environmental acoustic event. But he was awake before dawn, standing outside the command tent in the dark, which I know because I could not sleep and I could see him from the shed window, just standing there in the cold with his arms at his sides, looking north. I think that was the moment I understood the shape of what we were in. Not the specifics, not yet, but the shape. 47 men, a set of regulations, a captain with a sealed piece of prior knowledge, and something outside the fence that was older than any of it, and was not afraid of any of it, and was simply deciding, at its own pace and for its own reasons, what to do with us. The following morning, a man named Garrett did not come back from his watch rotation. He had been on the southern perimeter, the far end, away from the forest, the supposedly quiet end. 2 men from the next rotation found his post empty. His rifle was there. His jacket was there. He was not. There was no sign of a struggle, no tracks leading away, no indication of which direction he might have gone. He had simply been there, and then not been there, and the ground between those 2 facts offered nothing. Aldrich ordered an immediate search of the full perimeter. Every man, every corner of the clearing, the supply sheds, the area around the mule enclosure. 45 men searching a space that took about 12 minutes to walk around. We found nothing. Callum, the veterinary assistant, checked the mules to see if they showed any sign of disturbance. They were pressed against the south wall again. He said their behavior was consistent with a stress response. Nobody asked him what was causing the stress. We already knew. Aldrich stood in the center of the clearing when the search concluded and looked at each section leader in turn. Then he looked at the northern tree line. His jaw was set, and his expression was the most controlled thing I had ever seen on a human face. He said, "Garrett is to be recorded as missing pending further investigation." He said it clearly and then went back to the command tent. Raymond wrote it down. Then he looked up at me over the edge of the notebook, and what was in his face was not fear exactly. It was the expression of a man whose worst hypothesis had just been confirmed, and who was not sure whether being right was better or worse than being wrong. Nobody searched for Garrett after the first day. That was the thing nobody said out loud, but everyone understood. Aldrich kept the formal missing status in the log. Raymond kept writing. The section leaders ran their rotations. The work continued. But not one man volunteered to go past the fence line to look, and Aldrich did not order anyone to. He could have. Technically, it was within his authority to send a search party into the surrounding terrain. He did not do it. I think he understood, the way he seemed to understand several things before the rest of us caught up, that whatever had happened to Garrett was not something a search party was going to resolve. You do not send men into a forest to find someone when the forest is the problem. What Garrett's disappearance did to the group was quieter and more thorough than panic. Panic at least has energy to it. What settled over those 45 remaining men was more like a recalibration, a slow adjustment of what was considered normal. The first morning after, men ate breakfast with a kind of careful deliberateness, like they were performing routine rather than living it. Conversations were shorter. Movements were more considered. People stopped walking alone to the far end of the clearing, even during daylight hours. Nobody discussed this. It just happened, like a murmuration of birds adjusting direction all at once, without a signal anyone could point to. I noticed Owen had begun sleeping with one hand resting on his pack, which was unusual for him. He was the kind of man who slept flat and still and woke clean, like a machine shutting down and restarting. The hand on the pack was new. I did not mention it. He would not have explained it anyway, and I think I already knew what it meant. He was ready to move at a moment's notice. He had been ready since before Garrett, actually. Garrett just confirmed what Owen had already decided about the situation. Raymond came to me 3 days after Garrett with something he had found in the folded papers at the back of his notebook. He had a habit, as I mentioned, of carrying printed reference materials inside the notebook cover, things he had collected before the posting. Regional histories, survey notes, that kind of thing. One of them was a transcribed account from a local church archive, maybe 100 years old. A record from a mountain community that had existed briefly in roughly the same highland area before being abandoned. The official church record listed the abandonment as due to soil failure and supply difficulties. The transcriber had added a note in the margin from a separate private source, a letter from the community's appointed clerk, written in the weeks before the abandonment. The clerk wrote that the community had begun hearing sounds from the upper forest at night. He wrote that their animals had become unmanageable. He wrote that 2 members of the community had walked out of camp during the night and been found the following morning standing at the northern tree line, facing the forest, with no memory of how they had arrived there. I read that last part twice. I looked up at Raymond. He said, "Garrett did not disappear from the southern perimeter." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I checked the ground again this morning on my own. The boot impressions in the soil around his post do not end at the perimeter. They continue northward. He had walked north in the night, through the gate, into the forest. His boots, not bare feet, not dragged, walking under his own effort." Raymond closed the notebook. He said, I think something called to him, and I think it was the same thing that called to those two people a century ago. And I think the only reason the rest of us are still here is that it has not decided to call to us yet. I sat with that for a long time after he left. I did not sleep the following 2 nights, not fully. I would drift and then surface, listening, checking whether the sounds were back, whether my own feet were still where I had left them. It sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. There is a particular kind of fear that does not announce itself with a racing heart and cold sweat. It is quieter than that. It lives in the way you move through a space, the way you position yourself in a room, the way you listen before you speak. It was in all of us by that point. You could see it in the small adjustments, the way a man stands differently when he is not sure the ground beneath him is entirely friendly. On the 11th night, everything shifted. I was on a middle-of-the-night watch rotation with a man named Cole, the former timber worker, big and steady, not easily rattled. We were on the eastern perimeter, maybe 20 meters apart, both facing outward toward the dark. The night was very clear and very cold, the stars sharp above the clearing, the kind of cold that makes the air feel brittle. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. Then Cole said my name. Not loudly, just my name, low and direct, in the tone you use when you need someone to be very still and very alert immediately. I turned to look at him. He was not looking at me. He was looking out toward the northern section of the perimeter, slightly off his own post. I followed his line of sight. There was something at the fence, not at the spot where the marks had been, further along, near the northern gate. It was standing just outside the fence, and it was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and the proportions were wrong in ways that my eyes kept trying to correct and failing. The arms were too long. The head was tilted at an angle that suggested attention rather than anatomy. The skin, and I could see skin because it was pale in the starlight, caught the light with no warmth at all, like cold stone reflects light without absorbing any of it. It was completely still. It was facing inward, facing the camp. Cole and I stood without moving. Seconds passed that felt like much longer. And then, without any preparatory movement, without shifting weight or turning its head, the figure stepped backward into the trees, and the darkness closed around it as if it had never been there. Cole exhaled slowly beside me. I realized I had not breathed in some time. My hands were not shaking. I was past shaking by that point. I was in a place beyond shaking, where the body stops performing fear and just becomes it. We finished the rotation. At shift change, I went directly to the command tent and woke Aldrich. He was already half awake, sitting up in the dark like a man who had not been fully asleep for some time. I told him what we had seen. He listened, asked 2 specific questions about height and position, and then was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want you and Cole at morning assembly." He said it with the voice of a man finalizing a decision he had already been building toward for some time. I walked back to the shed and lay down on my bunk and stared at the timber ceiling. I thought about the fence marks, the sight lines, the clerk's letter from a century ago, Garrett's boot prints heading north. I thought about the way Owen had placed his hand on his pack. I thought about what Raymond had said, and I thought about something I had not let myself think clearly until that moment. We were not the primary concern here. We were a temporary presence in a space that had its own permanent occupant. And that occupant had been watching us, measuring us, and had now shown itself. Not as a mistake, not by accident, as a decision. It had wanted us to see it. The morning assembly, after Cole and I reported what we had seen, was the quietest I had ever stood in among a group of armed men. Aldrich did not ask us to repeat what we had seen. He had already heard it from both of us separately, asked his specific questions, and arrived at whatever internal conclusion he was going to arrive at. What he did at assembly was stand in front of 45 men in the frozen morning air and say, clearly and without preamble, that the posting parameters were being reviewed, and that until further notice, all perimeter watches would operate in pairs rather than individually. He said this in his weather report voice. He said the buddy rotation was a precaution in response to Garrett's disappearance, and that all other procedures would remain unchanged. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked questions. But something happened in that assembly that I have never seen happen so quickly in a group of people. 45 men made a collective, silent decision. Not about what to do, about what they were in. You could see it cross the group like wind crossing water, a ripple, a surface change. They had all been holding individual private versions of the fear, each man managing his own reading of the situation, and in that moment, without a word exchanged, the readings merged. They all knew. And knowing together was both better and worse than knowing alone. Owen came to find me after assembly. He said, "Aldrich is going to move us out." I asked him how he knew. He said, "Because I would." And he is better at this than I am. I believed him on both counts. The next 2 days were the strangest of the entire posting. Everything continued. Patrols ran, meals were prepared, supply counts were logged. But underneath the routine, something had shifted in the texture of the camp. Men were more careful with each other. Not warmer exactly, but more deliberate, more present. When someone spoke to you, you looked at them properly. When someone was struggling with a load, someone else appeared without being asked. It was the behavior of people who have reached the part of a situation where the only thing that still makes sense is each other. Raymond barely slept. I know because I woke several times each night, and he was always sitting up in the shed with a notebook open and a stub of candle burning. He was going through the printed papers again, cross-referencing, writing long passages that he would then scratch partially out and rewrite. On the second night, I asked him what he was working on. He said he was trying to document what had happened in a way that would be believed by someone who had not been there. He said most of what he had written so far would not be believed, and he was trying to find the version of the truth that had a chance. I asked him if he thought there was one. He said he did not know, but he kept writing. On the 13th night, everything the posting had been building toward arrived without warning. I woke in complete darkness to the sound of the supply shed gate, not forced, opened, the slow, careful sound of a latch being lifted from outside by something that understood what a latch was. I was on my feet before I was fully conscious. Owen was already sitting upright beside me, his hand on his pack. The shed had gaps between the wall planks, old timber that had warped in the damp, and through those gaps came thin strips of pale moonlight. I pressed myself to the wall and looked through the nearest gap. The figure was already inside the perimeter. It had come through the gate, and it was crossing the clearing at a slow and completely unhurried pace. 7 meters tall, maybe more. It was difficult to judge scale at night without reference points, and the proportions were wrong enough that scale kept slipping on me. The pale skin absorbed no warmth from the moonlight. The arms hung lower than they should have, and the fingers were long, and the stride covered enormous ground with each step, so that the clearing, which took a man maybe 30 seconds to cross at pace, it crossed in what felt like just a few slow, deliberate steps. It stopped near the center of the clearing, 15 meters from the supply shed. It was facing the command tent. I could hear nothing except my own heartbeat. The camp was silent. No movement from any of the other sheds. Whether the other men were awake and still, or asleep through some effect I cannot explain, I do not know. What I know is that Owen and I were the only ones moving, and we were barely moving at all. And every instinct in both of us was saying the same thing with complete clarity. Do not make yourself known. The figure stood facing the command tent for what I believe was close to 2 full minutes. It did not move. It looked at the tent the way you look at something you are making a decision about. There was nothing frantic in it, nothing threatening in the way that a raised weapon is threatening. It was more like the attention of something that has no reason to hurry, because it has never needed to hurry, and is simply working through a process at its own pace. Then it turned, not toward the tent, toward us, toward the supply shed. The head moved first, just the head, the body following a half-second later in a way that was not how a person turns, and the eyes caught the moonlight. They were pale, a cold amber color, and they did not reflect light the way animal eyes do, with that wet, luminous quality. They caught it and held it, flat and steady. They looked directly at the gap in the wall where Owen and I were standing, directly at us. It knew. It had known since it came through the gate. It had known we were there the entire time, and had simply been attending to other things first. Owen did not move. I did not move. The figure held that gaze for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it looked away, back toward the command tent, and stood for another long moment. Then it walked to the northern fence, stepped through the gate with the same unhurried care it had entered with, and the forest took it. The pine trees closed behind it, and the clearing was empty, and the moonlight was just moonlight again. Owen exhaled through his nose, one slow, controlled breath. He sat down in his bunk without a word. I sat down on mine. We sat in the dark for a long time without speaking. Eventually, he said one thing. He said, it came to look at Aldrich. He said it quietly and with certainty. And then he lay down and closed his eyes, and I do not know how that man slept after what we had just seen, but his breathing was even within minutes. I sat awake until dawn with my back against the wall and my eyes on the shed door, and I thought about the gate. The gate had been closed when I checked it the previous evening. Something had opened it from the outside with full knowledge of how a latch works, and it had closed it again on the way out. That detail, the closed gate on the way out, was the one that stayed with me longest, because it meant consideration. It meant choice. Whatever had walked through our camp that night had not been passing through. It had come for a reason, conducted its visit, and left everything as it found it. That was not the behavior of something dangerous in the way we normally understand dangerous. It was the behavior of something with authority, something checking on a situation it considered its own concern. Aldrich called assembly at first light, and his face told us everything before he said a single word. Not because it showed fear, because it showed resolution, the kind of resolution that only appears on a person's face after a private reckoning has already been completed. after the internal argument has been had and won and the result accepted. He looked like a man who had spent the night arriving at a conclusion he did not particularly want, but was going to act on without flinching. I recognized it because I had seen something like it on my mother's face the morning she packed up my father's remaining belongings 3 weeks after he left. Not grief. The face of someone doing what needs doing. He stood in front of 45 men in the gray early light, and he said, "We are withdrawing from this posting effective this morning." He said it in the same flat, clean voice he used for everything, the voice that contained no invitation for discussion. He said the position was being reclassified as operationally non-viable, and that the withdrawal had been authorized at his discretion under field assessment protocols. He did not explain what had changed. He did not describe what he and I both knew had walked through the camp gate the night before. He did not mention the gate. He gave the order, assigned each section leader a specific packing task, stated that we would be moving out within 3 hours, and dismissed the assembly. Nobody cheered. Nobody expressed relief. What moved through the group was more like the release of a breath that 45 men had been holding for 2 weeks, quiet and collective and without celebration, because everyone understood that the hard part was not yet behind them. The hard part was the 3 kilometers of forest road that stood between us and the open valley below, and the forest was still the forest. Raymond was beside me when Aldrich dismissed us. He said he made the right call. I said I knew. Raymond said, "I mean he made it the right way," without explaining, without trying to make the record match what actually happened. He knows the record will never match, and he is not going to exhaust himself trying to make it. That is a particular kind of wisdom that most people never develop. I thought about that for a long time afterward. He was right. Aldrich was protecting the men twice over, once by getting them out, and once by not making them carry the official version of events alongside everything else. We packed with a speed I had not seen from that unit in the entire 2 weeks of the posting. There was no delay, no dragging, no one needing to be told twice. Tents came down in minutes. The cook grate was disassembled and loaded. The supply sheds were cleared and the contents distributed across the sledges in an order that was not particularly efficient, but was very fast, and nobody complained about the inefficiency. The mules, which had been pressed against the south wall of their enclosure for the better part of a week, moved without resistance when we hitched them to the sledges. They were calm in a way they had not been since the first days. Owen noticed it. He said to me quietly, "They know we are leaving." He said it without any particular emotion, as a fact. The perimeter fires had been burning at the 4 corners of the clearing since the first week, maintained through every rotation as a matter of standing procedure. When the time came to extinguish them, Aldrich did it himself. He went to each one and put it out personally, using a canvas bucket from the cook station. I watched him do it. 4 fires, 4 corners, walking the perimeter one last time. When the 4th fire went out, the clearing changed. Not in any way I can describe precisely, but it did. The light was the same overcast morning light. The trees were the same trees, but something in the quality of the clearing shifted, as if the fires had been doing something more than providing warmth and light, as if extinguishing them was a signal, an acknowledgement, and whatever was in the forest had received it. We moved out in column at mid-morning. 45 men, 2 sledges, 4 mules, everything we could carry. The valley road south ran between close-pressed trees for the first several kilometers before the terrain opened out below the snow line. And that first stretch was the one everyone was thinking about. Nobody said so, but I could feel it in the way the column organized itself, tighter than regulation required, men staying closer to each other than they needed to, the section leaders positioned outward-facing without being told. Owen walked near the front. I walked just behind him. Raymond was 3 places behind me, notebook inside his coat against his chest. The forest on both sides was completely still. No wind, no bird sound, no branch movement. Just the sound of boots on frozen road and the creak of the sledge runners and the soft, labored breath of the mules. The cold had a physical weight to it, pressing down through the canopy, and the smell of the trees was very strong. That cold resin and wet stone, and underneath it that older scent I still could not name. We moved through it in silence for about 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. Not a word. Not one word for 40 minutes of walking through that forest. I kept my eyes forward and slightly down, watching the road surface, watching my own footing, deliberately not looking into the trees on either side, because some part of me had decided that looking into the trees was an invitation, and I was not going to extend one. Owen did the same. I could see his eyes in my peripheral vision, fixed ahead. The only man who watched the trees the whole way was Raymond, because Raymond was recording. Even there, even in that march, he was cataloging. I did not envy him that obligation. When the valley opened below us and the tree line fell back and the sky came in wide and gray overhead, the change in the column was immediate and physical. Shoulders dropped. The pace loosened. Someone near the back exhaled loudly, and a few men actually laughed, short and compressed, more like pressure releasing than laughter. But not many, and not for long, because we all knew that Garrett was not with us. And we all knew we were not going to be able to explain that in any way that made sense to anyone who had not been there. Owen stopped walking for a moment as the trees gave way. He stood at the exact edge where the forest ended and the open valley began, and he looked back once. One look, measured and complete, the way he looked at everything. Then he turned south and kept walking. I did not look back. I had already decided I was not going to, and I held to it, and I have never regretted it. The town at the bottom of the valley appeared after another 2 hours of walking, and as we came down the final slope toward it, a figure appeared at the road. An old man, unhurried, like he had been expecting us. He looked at the column. He counted. His lips moved as he counted. Then he looked at Aldrich at the head of the column and said something to the interpreter walking beside him. The interpreter said, "He wants to know who you left it for." Aldrich told the old man that nobody had been left for anything, that a man had gone missing and the unit was withdrawing on his command. And the old man looked at him with the patient expression of someone listening to a foreign language they do not speak, but recognize the sound of. He did not argue. He did not push back. He simply looked at Aldrich for a long moment, then looked at the rest of us standing there in the road with our sledges and our mules, and our collective silence. And then he turned and walked back toward the nearest house without another word. The interpreter looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at the road ahead. He said, "We keep moving." We kept moving. I have thought about that exchange almost as many times as I have thought about the figure in the clearing. The old man had not asked whether something had been seen. He had not asked what had happened. He had counted the men in the column and immediately understood that someone was missing. And his first question had been about the terms. Who did you leave it for? Not who did you lose, not what happened to him. Who did you leave him for? As if the concept of a person being taken was foreign, but the concept of a person being offered was completely familiar, like it was something that had a name in his understanding of how things worked up in that pass, a category he already had a word for. We did not have a word for it. That was the difference between us and him, and it was not a small difference. We were dispersed and formally reassigned over the following 2 days at a junction point further south. The unit was broken up, men sent to different posts. The whole apparatus of the posting quietly dissolved into the administrative machinery of the larger operation. The official record, which I saw briefly when Raymond showed me the draft that Aldrich filed, described the position as decommissioned due to adverse terrain conditions and resupply impracticability. The highland route was marked as closed. A replacement corridor was designated 15 kilometers to the west. Raymond told me that notation in the record was permanent, that the western route had been maintained ever since, that nobody had tried to reopen the Highland Pass. I do not know how he knew that, but I believed him. I went home. That is the simplest way to say it. I went back to the mill town and the timber yard and the work and my mother's kitchen table and the arithmetic of ordinary life. I did not speak of what had happened, not to my mother, not to the men I worked alongside, not to anyone. It was not a difficult silence to maintain because nobody asked the right questions, and the wrong questions were easy to deflect. I told my mother the posting had been uneventful, and she looked at me the way she always looked at me and said nothing, which meant she did not believe me, and also that she was not going to push. We understood each other in that economy of unsaid things. It is one of the things I am most grateful for about her. I married in my late 20s. I raised children. I worked. The years accumulated the way years do when you are paying attention to other things. But Garrett never left my mind entirely. Not once in all those years did a full week pass without me thinking about him, about his boots in the soil pointing north, about the gate opened and then closed again, about the old man at the road counting the column, about who, exactly, had been left for what. I looked for Owen for years. He was difficult to find because he had no fixed address that I could locate, the way men who have spent long years in open country sometimes do not. I found him finally in my early 40s through a chain of letters to regional livestock associations and a response from a land agent who knew his name. He was working a piece of hill country far south of the posting area, far south of anything that would have been in range of those mountains, and I do not think that was a coincidence. I wrote to him. He wrote back, brief and direct in the way he always had been. He confirmed everything I remembered. He said he had no additions and no corrections. He said there was one thing he had not mentioned at the time, which he had decided not to mention because he did not think it would help anyone to know it during the posting itself. He said he would tell me if I wanted to know. I wrote back the same day. I told him I wanted to know. His reply came 3 weeks later. 4 sentences. I have read it so many times since that I no longer need to hold the paper to see the words. He wrote that on the night the figure came through the gate and stood in the clearing and looked at the command tent. He had watched it from the shed wall the entire time. He wrote that at one point, while it was standing facing the tent, it had raised one hand and placed it flat against the canvas, very briefly, and then lowered it. He wrote that after it lowered its hand, it had stood still for a long time, before choosing to walk away. He wrote that in all his years working with animals, which was most of his life, he had only ever seen that gesture in one context: a creature pressing its hand against a barrier and then choosing not to break through it. And the only time animals made that choice, in his experience, was when they had decided the thing on the other side was not worth the cost. I sat with that letter for a long time after I read it. He was not saying we had been spared because we were harmless. He was not saying it had misjudged us. He was saying something more specific and more unsettling. He was saying that something ancient and enormous and entirely unbothered by anything we had brought with us into that forest had stood at the thin canvas wall of our commander's tent, pressed its hand to the surface, felt what was on the other side, and made a calculation. And the result of that calculation was that we were allowed to leave, not rescued, not pitied, permitted, the way you permit a thing that is trespassed but is not worth the energy of a response, the way territory asserts itself without violence, because violence would be an overreaction to something as temporary as us. Owen died several years after that letter. I never saw him in person again. I wrote twice more, and he replied both times, briefly, and then the letters stopped, and eventually a land agent wrote to tell me he had passed on in the winter. I have thought of him often since. He was the most honest person I met in that posting, honest in the particular way of people who do not perform. What he saw clearly. What he thought precisely. And what he held back for good reason. There was one other person I needed to account for: Raymond, the school teacher with the notebook and the printed papers, and the handwriting that stayed careful even when everything else was coming apart. I had lost track of him in the reassignment. For a long time I assumed he had simply gone back to teaching and had said nothing, the same as me. Then, in my late 50s, I found a reference to his name in a regional archive catalog. Not a record of what he had written, just a reference to its existence and its current status. The notebook, and apparently a longer document he had written afterward, had been submitted to a government records office some years after the posting, and had been placed under a classification review that, as of the catalog date, had not been resolved. The catalog listed the material as restricted pending assessment of public interest implications. I requested access through the proper channels. I was thanked for my inquiry and told that the material was not available for public review. I requested again 2 years later. Same response. I stopped requesting after that, not because I accepted the answer, but because I understood what the answer meant. Someone had read what Raymond wrote. Someone had decided it was not for general consumption. And that decision, the fact of it, told me something more clearly than any declassified document could have. It told me that whatever Raymond had assembled in that notebook, the cross-referenced accounts, the church archive passage, the documented progression of events, was coherent enough and sourced enough to be considered a problem. You do not restrict things that are easy to dismiss. Every account I found in those archives ended the same way, not with a description of what was encountered, with a departure. That pattern took me years to recognize clearly because I was looking for the wrong thing. I had spent decades searching for explanations, for documentation, for some framework that would make what I had experienced sit neatly inside a category I could hand to another person. I looked in regional historical records during my 50s and into my 60s, spending time in libraries and church archives in the towns closest to that highland area. What I found was not explanations. What I found was repetition. A land survey team that had gone into the Upper Valley 2 decades before our posting. The official record listed their early withdrawal as due to equipment failure and winter weather conditions arriving ahead of forecast. A private letter from the team leader, held in a local church archive because he had addressed it to a minister rather than his employer, described 4 nights of sounds and the discovery of something pressed into the wet clay at their camp boundary. He did not describe what the impression looked like. He said only that it was large, and that after seeing it, the team had agreed unanimously to leave without completing the survey. He said unanimous agreement among that particular group of men, who had disagreed on everything else for the entire posting, was itself enough of an answer. A logging operation, earlier still. Company records showed the site was abandoned after 6 weeks, with timber rights transferred to a different area further west. No explanation given beyond the phrase, operational reassessment. In the foreman's personal journal, donated to a regional archive by his family after his passing, there was a single entry about the abandonment. It read, "The men will not stay, and I will not ask them to. There are limits to what a man can reasonably require of another, and we have found one." A military patrol from a generation before us. Again, official records clean and bloodless. Terrain assessment, repositioning, routine administrative decisions. And in a handwritten account found folded inside a donated Bible in a small community collection, a single paragraph from a soldier who had been in that patrol, written decades after the fact. He wrote that his unit had spent 11 nights at a highland post, and that on the 12th morning, their commanding officer had given the order to withdraw without explanation, and that every man had understood the explanation without needing to hear it. 11 nights. We had lasted 13. I do not know what to make of that difference. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps it meant something. Perhaps the thing in that forest has its own calculus that has nothing to do with numbers. And I am still, after 67 years, trying to apply human logic to something that has none of our logic in it at all. What struck me about all of these accounts, the survey team, the loggers, the earlier patrol, ours, was that not one of them reported being harmed in the traditional sense. Not one described a direct confrontation. What each of them described, in their different languages and their different eras, was a sustained pressure. The sense of being observed, the gradual understanding that the observation was deliberate and that it was coming from something that did not share any of our assumptions about the world. And then, in every case, the departure, a decision made and acted on, a column of men or a team of workers or a survey crew walking south out of the valley and not returning. And in every case, the official record describing something entirely different. Equipment, weather, administrative decisions, the machinery of institutional language doing what it has always done, which is convert what actually happened into something that can be filed and forgotten. I am 83 years old, and I am sitting by my window above my son's hardware store, and I have been talking for some time now. My coffee went cold an hour ago. Outside the window, the street is ordinary and bright and full of people moving through a day that makes complete sense to them. And I am glad for that, genuinely glad, because I know what it feels like to be in a place where the day stops making sense and the ordinary rules stop applying, and you understand that you have wandered into a version of the world that was here long before any of us and will be here long after. That understanding is what I want to leave you with, because it is the only honest conclusion I have arrived at in 67 years of thinking about what happened in that forest. We have a habit, as a species, of treating the world as though it belongs to us, as though our presence in a place is the primary fact of that place, and everything else in it is secondary. We walk into territory, and we clear it, and we name it, and we build our fences, and we file our records, and we genuinely believe, at some level, that the act of documentation makes a place ours, that writing it down is the same as owning it. What I learned in that Highland posting, and what every survey team and logging crew and military patrol before and after us learned in the same place, is that there are territories in this world where that assumption simply does not hold, where the primary fact of the place is not you and has never been you and is entirely indifferent to your paperwork, where something older than your records, older than your language, older than the names you gave the mountains, is going about its own existence at its own pace, and your presence is at most a minor inconvenience to be assessed and then dismissed. We were dismissed. That is the accurate word for what happened to us. Not defeated, not driven out, dismissed. The way you dismiss something that wandered where it should not have, once you have determined it knows enough to find its own way back. Aldrich understood that faster than any of us. He understood it the way good commanders understand things, not by overanalyzing them, but by reading them clearly and responding without ego. He did not ask whether his authority was sufficient for the situation. He understood it was not, and he acted on that understanding. That decision, made cleanly and without performance, brought 44 men home who might otherwise have stayed too long and tested the patience of something that has no particular interest in being patient. The pass is still there. The forest is still there. The western route that was designated after our posting has, to my knowledge, remained the operative route ever since. Nobody goes into the upper valley anymore, not for any purpose that gets written down. The mountain continues. Whatever lives in it continues. The arrangement holds. Here's what I believe after a lifetime of turning this over. Courage is not always the thing that makes you stay. Sometimes the most honest and intelligent thing a person can do is recognize that they are standing on ground that was never theirs and walk away from it without pretending otherwise. The paperwork will say what the paperwork always says, but the men who were there will always know what the morning light looked like when Aldrich put out that last fire and the clearing changed. That knowledge does not fade. It just waits, quiet and exact, like something patient in the dark. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If you were in that clearing on the night the figure came through the gate, and you had a weapon in your hands, and you were afraid, would you have held still the way Owen held still? Or would you have done something that could not be undone? Because that choice, in that moment, is the only reason some of us came home. And I am not sure most people, faced with it, would make the right one. Tell me what you think in the comments. I mean it. I want to know. If this story stayed with you, please leave a like and subscribe. There are more accounts like this one, and every one of them deserves to be heard.